Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fidesz Bickman, and I facilitated the session on relationships between government and philanthropists and philanthropy, and obviously that also includes a little bit of a discussion around legal frameworks. And I did this on behalf of the organization which I chair, which is the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. Can I start? Okay. There we go. So, I mean, just to kind of summarize in one sentence, one of the main themes of our discussion was that, the relationships with government and legal frameworks for civil society and philanthropy can present certain barriers and incentives. So, at the end of the various small group discussions and a larger group discussion, what we ended up looking at in specifics was what are some of the barriers and what are some of the incentives. Some of the key issues that we talked about were regulation, and this was a very interesting discussion because within that there's the issue of overregulation versus underregulation versus self-regulation, and ultimately, how to manage that space, because this is something that ultimately does affect our relationships with government as NGOs or foundations or as individual donors. Taxation, another key issue that came up, especially around deductions for NGOs or deductions for philanthropists and donors. Foreign funding, the various countries that were in the room that are struggling to some degree with this were Russia, and then, with Jerry giving some examples about Ethiopia, and this is still, as many of you know, quite a serious issue in a lot of countries. Relationships and partnerships with government. So aside from the legal framework, how do we relate with government? How do we deal with some of the fear that sometimes civil society, or the threat that civil society and philanthropy, some of the issues that we work on, may pose to governments? And together with that, a lack of understanding about the sector, not necessarily only within government, but within society overall, and the capacity and the know-how of the civil service that's actually responsible for drafting legislation, implementing regulation, and oversight within the government. So, that's our group. Some of the key actors within this space, obviously governments, NGOs, foundations, social enterprises, businesses, individual donors. I think one of the other key themes that will show up also as an opportunity for further examination is how some of these groups form as interest groups and really lobby for the kinds of relationships and laws and frameworks that they would like. And for all of these groups, NGOs, foundations, enterprises, businesses, individual donors, those are very different issues. And I think one of the challenges is that sometimes under umbrella organization and advocacy efforts, not all of the rights holders or the actual stakeholders themselves are necessarily the ones lobbying for their own interests. Sometimes it's under a broader umbrella, and that could be posing some challenges. In terms of opportunities, I think one of the key messages, certainly not all of them, it was an hour-and-a-half discussion, so unable to really articulate all of that in this short summary, but one of the opportunities is that self-regulation can really contribute to harnessing the sector's knowledge and expertise. So not that self-regulation is the only way, but that self-regulation is an important contribution to the way that the sector is regulated. And it was wonderful to hear from CAF South Africa about the independent code, which was developed with companies and NGOs to regulate their own relationship in a kind of preemptive move toward a government hinting that they would like to present some regulations themselves. And I think here one idea might be for different groups in this room and in our network to be sharing various different codes that we've developed in terms of self-regulation, just to kind of see how they differ across countries. In terms of barriers, the burden of regulation and over-regulation, as I've described, the lack of regulation, I mean, just as much as we don't want to be over-regulated, I think we have to strike a balance with the risk of lack of regulation, in which we have some bad practices of corruption and a lack of transparency, which ultimately lead to the lack of trust in society, which affects us in terms of participations and donations. Tax deductions, the lack thereof, can be a significant barrier, but not obviously the only one. and the fear resulting in government control and in situations where governments feel this kind of threat. Oh, and foreign funding. I'm being a bit repetitive, I see here now. And incentives. So just as much as the tax deductions or lack thereof can be a barrier, it can also be an incentive. Self-regulation, it can be an incentive, as can flexibility, so allowing organizations and donors and various actors within this ecosystem of philanthropy to be able to self-define and not always act according to a certain category. So there was much discussion around hybrid organizations and not necessarily having to pinpoint very structured, specific ways of working, and allowing organizations to be doing a number of things at the same time. Ease of compliance and regulations, we don't, this could be an incentive for more philanthropists and more individuals to get active in the third sector because it can be a significant restriction, reporting requirements and so on. And partnerships, specifically with government. And there was discussion around an example, I think, in China with the Clinton Foundation, and being able to highlight the success stories around that. So I don't really know how to make this visible. There we go. Cool. So within that, really there are kind of two main areas here. One is, in terms of being able to increase the visibility of the sector and to be able to communicate the needs and the activities, to focus a lot on data collection and analysis and to be able to present that information in a quantitative way, but also in a qualitative way with regards to success stories in which partnerships have been effective. And I think the overall summary of all of this, when it comes down to it, is how do we improve our relationship with government, and how do we participate in the creation of more enabling legal environment. And at the end of the day, I think the overarching message is we need to be communicating more effectively with those in government, and also try and contribute to the capacity and the know-how of people working in government so that they can engage with civil society and philanthropy more effectively. Thank you. Super.